Hello, hello, everybody. Hello. Hi, Liz from Scotland. Oh, Rilo, no. Oh my God, my cat, stop it. Hi, Letitia. All right, Ubi, you need to go over here. There, bud. Sorry. Oh my God. Okay. Am I gonna have to fight with you, bud? Okay, come on. All right, so hi, Katie from Alabama. All right, so if anyone happens to follow me on a regular basis for book readings, everyone knows. Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Oh my God! Everyone knows that today I'm actually not supposed to be reading. Like this week, I'm actually doing a book reading for this live. So I've been reading for the past few weeks now from this Cleopatra's Daughter. Um, and the reason I'm doing a reading right now, it's completely in wrong time. I don't normally read at this time of day. It's the right day, Tuesdays and Fridays, but my last live on Friday did not record and process correctly. So, hi, Miss Deborah. Yes, this is a surprise for me too. Um, so our reading last Friday did not process, so I need to reread the ending of our story again. So for anyone who's joined us for the first time, welcome. This is the story we're reading from. Oh my God, there's so much in this book that I would even have to stop and explain what all is going on. But if you want to play catch up, if you've never read from this story before, you can find all of my pre-recorded readings on my YouTube page. Just go to my bio and click the little Instagram computer icon camera thing. It'll take you to my YouTube channel, and everything's listed in order so you can't get lost. But yeah, so today's a makeup day for anyone who wants to hang out and listen to the end of this story again or for the first time. You are more than welcome. It's going to take about 2 hours. It just so you know, it's going to take about 2 hours to get to the end of this final bit. So without further ado, God, here we go. Oh man. Crazy Stitches, hello, good afternoon. Buckle up, everybody, here we go. I'll look up once in a while and answer questions if I can, if you've got them for me. Here we go. Before Alexander blew out the oil lamps in our room that night, I turned on my side to face him. It's a dirty system, isn't it? No more than in Egypt. And where's the better way? Perhaps if they forbade slavery. But my brother laughed sadly. And do you think the patricians would allow that? All of their fields, which make them rich, would have to be tended by workers they actually paid. So what? They're all wealthy enough. It would never pass the Senate. Even if Augustus paid the senators to vote in favor of banishing slavery, they'd be risking their lives. The plebes would revolt. The patricians aren't the only ones with slaves. And in the end, what would it accomplish? Men would simply forbid their slaves from leaving on punishment of death. And the courts could run every day from now until next Saturnalia before they found Judases willing to punish slave killers. I was quiet for a moment, angry that he was right. Are you going to come tomorrow? My brother hesitated. Virgil has a reading. And you would rather be at the Odeum instead of watching a trial for a girl's life? I sat up on my couch. Whenever Virgil is invited to the triclinium, you and Lucius hang on his every word, I said accusingly. What is it about him? He's just an old Ganymede. You shouldn't say that, my brother replied. Why? Isn't it true? Yes, but he writes about male love in a way that makes it beautiful. If you read some of his works, Celine, you might change your mind. I stared at him. You aren't in love with Lucius, are you? My brother blushed. With a man? I exclaimed. We haven't done anything, he said defensively. Just kissed. I regarded my brother. His namesake, Alexander the Great, had taken men to his bed and counted the soldier Hephaestion as one of his greatest loves. But he had also taken a wife and given Macedon an heir. So what do you think you will do when Augustus returns and wants to arrange a marriage for you? I whispered. Refuse? No one refuses Augustus. So why spend my last free years, maybe only months, at a trial whose outcome I can't change, when I can be with Lucius? We stared at each other from our couches, and I tried to determine what I felt about this. I'm sorry, Celine, it's nothing I can help. Have you even tried? Of course, he said swiftly. Why didn't you tell me this before? My voice broke. I thought you'd be disappointed. He waited for me to tell him I wasn't, that his desire for Lucius was as normal as Marcellus's desire for Julia, but I kept my silence, forcing him to explain. There are many men who aren't attracted to women. Look at Maecenius. You don't think it's a coincidence that Tarantilla's never had a child. Maecenius isn't interested, while Augustus has her drink the juice of the silphium plant to keep her from getting pregnant by him. How do you know that? I demanded crossly. I heard it from Maecenius. So men who love other men pass on their secrets to one another? My brother raised his brows. Don't women? And what does Vitruvius think of you two? He doesn't know, or maybe he doesn't want to. So this is why Lucius doesn't want to marry, I said. My brother nodded. Yes, but unless he can support himself or find a generous patron, he will have to someday. And then we'll both be miserable instead of just one of us. That's why I have to encourage his readings in the Odium. There's nothing I can do about slavery, Celine, but I can help change Lucius's life. He held out his hand to me, and slowly I took it. This isn't how I imagined our lives would be when I was queen of Libya and you king of Armenia. Alexander laughed sadly. Our father had great plans, didn't he? The kingdom of Parthia hadn't even been conquered, and he crowned me its king. We both smiled, remembering our father's irrepressible belief in himself. Do you think it's fate that we'll lead unfulfilled lives? Julie, what's up, brother? I drew back. Of course not. Augustus may still make you king. I know it's early. I actually am. I'm having to reread the last part because it didn't process last week, and so we're reading this again. We're reading the end again. Hi, boys. How are you? All right. I drew back. Of course not. Augustus may still make you after he's married me off to some widow. But you're a man. You can do as you please. Send her off to the country or keep her in Rome while you return to Egypt. Maecenius is content enough. But what about you? His voice was so gentle and full of concern that tears sprang to my eyes. I don't know. If you can forget Marcellus, perhaps you'll find someone else. For what purpose? To have my heart broken again? This isn't Egypt, Alexander. When Augustus returns, he'll find me a husband that's convenient for him, not me. It could be someone like Catullus or even Aquila, and there would be nothing I could do if he forbade me from visiting you in Alexandria. I would never return without you, he swore. Yes, I said firmly, you would. It's your destiny. I looked outside. The gardens, which shone blue and green every summer, were still dreary and soaked with rain. I don't think unhappiness is faded. Look at Gallia. She was forced into slavery and still found happiness. Because you freed her. But even as citizens we aren't free. Everything we do, from the food we eat to the clothes we wear, is determined by Augustus. And you've always been the one telling me to be practical. But now look, you've lost your heart to Lucius, and it's making you crazy. My brother turned away. It would be different if Augustus died in Gaul, wouldn't it? Marcellus is old enough now to be Caesar, and he would let us marry whomever we wanted. Then we could return to Alexandria. Augustus's letters to Octavia are always short, I said eagerly, and Julia says she heard that he spends most of his days sleeping. He isn't strong. My brother raised his eyes. From your mouth to Isis's ears, he whispered. Chapter 17. The name of the book is Cleopatra's Daughter. Gertrude. Before Isis could make a decision about my brother's prayer, she acted on one of my silent pleas. I was leaving the library where Vitruvius was making the plans for the Pantheon's final steps when Octavia rushed in, too anxious to even realize I was there. "He's back!" she exclaimed, "and they're all over Rome. We finally have proof it wasn't Marcellus." Vitruvius rose from his desk. "Another actum? On the temples of Apollo, Jupiter, Vesta, Castor and Pollux, even Venus Genetrix. It's short, just a few lines calling people to the trial of Tullia, but Marcellus isn't here, and there's not a chance in Hades he could have done it." I rushed back to my chamber to tell Alexander the news, and my brother remarked, "So he wasn't lying." When Lucius met us on the portico, he grinned widely at me, as if he already knew what my brother had revealed about him last night, and that I had come to accept it. "I heard from my father about the actum. Now all of Rome will be at the trial." "I should think the weather will keep some people away. The old won't want to come, and certainly not mothers with their children," I said. But my prediction was wrong. Despite the dampness in the air, there wasn't any rain, and even matrons with babies on their hips came to see what had drawn the Red Eagle out of hiding. For months he had not posted a single actum. Whenever we went to the Ludus, I glanced at the doors of the temples we passed and felt a keen disappointment. The Red Eagle's absence had only made me more certain that he was Marcellus, but the latest message removed all possibility. Thousands of people had gathered in the forum. Even Octavia had been watching the trial since morning. She explained to us what was happening, and when she saw that Magister Varius had come with us, her eyebrows rose. "This has implications beyond one little girl," he replied to her unspoken question. Since the night of Magister Varius's arrest, Augustus's spies had been following him constantly. If they hadn't found anything yet, there was nothing to find. And now, with Marcellus in Gaul, the two men who had seemed most likely to be the Red Eagle were suddenly innocent. Alexander and Lucius stepped back, letting me stand in front of them so I could see what was happening. If a foreigner to the city had looked out over the handsomely dressed crowd of senators and their fur-cloaked wives, he would have thought he had happened upon a theatrical performance. But the danger to Tullia's life was real, and I wondered whether somewhere in the crowd, the Red Eagle was listening to her lawyer as he tried to persuade the Judases of her freeborn birth. "I have brought before you the maiden's mother, her father, 2 aunts, and an uncle, who all swear before Juno that she is the daughter of Centurion Calpurnius Commodus," Tullia's lawyer was saying. "Only purchased women have sworn that she is Aquila's slave. Whom will you believe?" he demanded. "Citizens of Rome or slaves?" "Correct me if I'm wrong," Aquila's lawyer retorted, "but I believe you produced slaves as witnesses as well." "With citizens? Where are your citizens?" Tullia's lawyer challenged. "Not a single plebe has come forward to vouch for Aquila's lies. Why is that?" The crowd began to hiss. "Perhaps Aquila spent all his denarii," he speculated, "paying off other people." He looked piercingly at the Judases, a warning to them that if Aquila's gold was in their pockets, they had better beware. The crowd raised fists of anger, shouting threats to the seated men in togas. I saw Aquila flinch as someone hurled a lettuce from the crowd, and one of the Judases was hit on the head. The Judex rose in a fury, turning to the spectators. "Since you cannot behave yourselves, we are done for the day. Trial will resume tomorrow." There was near mutiny. "Can he do that?" Alexander exclaimed. "Any of the Judases can stop the trial," Magister Varius said. "I suspect they will deliver a verdict in the morning." "And we will come to see it?" Julia asked. Magister Varius looked at Octavia. She surveyed the madness, and 2 small lines appeared between her brows. "Only with an escort of the Praetorian Guard. This courtyard will not be safe if the Judases determine that Tullia was a slave." As we returned to the Palatine, I asked Magister Varius who he believed the Red Eagle might be. For once, Julia stopped complaining about her hunger and listened. Even Alexander and Lucius were attentive. "Someone wealthy, with a personal interest in slavery and the education to write eloquently about it." "Oh, Ishmael, I started not too terribly long ago. I'm rereading the end of Cleopatra's Daughter because it didn't process last week." Nico, this isn't a picture book. This is the only picture of the book. But the rest of it is it's words. This isn't a picture book. Maybe I'll read a picture book in the future, but it's just words for right now. All right, let's see. And someone who is willing to risk death by crucifixion if he's caught, Octavia added. When he's caught, Agrippa said sternly, and it will only be a matter of time. A priest will see him posting one of his acta and think of the 5,000 denarii reward, or perhaps it will be a passing slave, or a young matron with 7 children to feed. There are many people in Rome whose lives could be changed by 5,000 denarii. And what would he be crucified for? I asked. Inciting rebellion, Agrippa answered swiftly, disturbing the lives of good citizens of Rome and provoking assassination. I thought the kitchen boy had nothing to do with the Red Eagle, my brother said. There are men who will take secrets with them to their graves, no matter the cost, Agrippa replied. He could have known the Red Eagle personally. But I didn't believe it. Faced with the most terrible kinds of torture, what man wouldn't speak to save his skin? For the rest of the afternoon, the Red Eagle was all anyone wanted to talk about, and that evening in Octavia's triclinium, Julia whispered, Perhaps he'll slit Aquila's throat in the night, and the trial will end. But has he ever killed before? Alexander asked. Of course, dozens of times, Julia told him. How do you know? Well, how else has he posted so many acta without a single person fingering him? He must kill his witnesses. Perhaps he uses disguises, I suggested, or goes in the night when everyone is sleeping. Julia tilted her head at me. Have you seen these streets at night? Julius Caesar forbade traffic from entering Rome during the day. As soon as the sun sets, there are thousands of merchants on the streets, not to mention cutthroats and lupe. But what would they be doing at the temples? I argued. They'd be in the Forum, where the shops are. The Temple of Venus Genitrix is in the Forum, Lucius pointed out, and he's posted there. Then perhaps he goes in the guise of a merchant, my brother said. We argued about it until Octavia determined it was time for us to retire to our chambers. Then Lucius followed us into our room and reclined on the same couch where Marcellus used to lie. The couch meant for Ptolemy. It's better that we went to the trial today, he said. I don't think there's anyone in Rome who believes that Tullia was a slave. If the Judases decide otherwise, there will be riots, I predicted. Julia should like that, Lucius remarked. She likes anything so long as there's action, my brother said. It has to be lonely in her father's house with only Drusus to talk to. And now only the slaves, Lucius remarked. When do you think they'll be coming home? Months yet, Alexander replied, maybe even years. But Marcellus might return before Augustus, I said hopefully. He's not a seasoned soldier. There's no reason for Augustus to keep him there so long. From my lips to Isis's ears, in 2 days my second plea was answered. First, the Red Eagle had returned to Rome. Then, before the sun even peeped through the slats of my shutters, there was a clamor in the atrium, laughter and shouts of tremendous joy. My brother sat up on his couch and looked at me. They've returned, I shouted. I threw off my covers and dressed as quickly as possible. I didn't bother with my hair, and my tunic was a mess, but when I flung open the door and saw Marcellus, I regretted not taking more time with my appearance. The 11 months he'd been away had turned him into a man. He was taller than I remembered, with broader shoulders and a leaner jaw. He looked well fed and rested, and he was dressed in a soldier's scarlet cloak and nail-studded boots. Antonia and Tonia were both laughing, touching the hunting horn that hung from a strap across his chest, and pointing to the double-edged sword at his side. Octavia beamed with pride, and Vitruvius could not have looked happier if Marcellus had been his own son. Marcellus grinned when he saw me. He crossed the atrium with open arms. Selene! I let him take me to his chest and inhaled the scent of rain and leather from his muscled cuirass. Look at you, he said, pulling away. A woman now. I'm sure I blushed, and I was thankful that the room was lit only by oil lamps. 11 months is a long time to be gone, I replied. You've changed as well. Really? Of course, don't you see it? Antonia asked. Your hair is longer. And your feet are bigger, Tonia exclaimed. Marcellus laughed. Well, if you think I've grown, you should see Tiberius. Has he come home with you? I frowned. Along with Juba. Augustus and Livia plan to remain until the rebellion in Gaul and the war in Cantabria are finished. But that could be years, Octavia worried. Or just a few months. Most of the Gallic rebellions have been crushed. It's just a matter of Iberia now. Marcellus saw my brother and smiled. Alexander. The two embraced, and Marcellus complimented my brother on his height. How is it that you can be 2 years younger than me and still as tall? It must be the Roman sun. It's not as strong in Gaul. There was a squeal of delight from behind him, and when Marcellus turned, Julia came into view. She was dressed in a tunic of diaphanous blue silk, with turquoise at her ears and around her neck. I looked like an underfed peasant compared to her, with her perfectly plump waist and ample chest. Only my brother and I were close enough to hear Marcellus catch his breath. Julia. She ran to him, and he held her in his arms and kissed her cheek. Behind her came Juba and Tiberius, both wearing short scarlet cloaks. Already the happy union, Juba said, watching me. Juba! Octavia's smile was wide. And Tiberius, she said delightedly. But why didn't anyone warn us of your coming? We thought it should be a surprise, Marcellus said, letting go of Julia. So was it? Octavia's eyes shone with tears. Yes. We won't go to the ludus today, will we? Julia pleaded. Octavia laughed. No, today will be a day of celebration. Faustina, she called to one of her slaves, let Magister Varius know there will be no ludus today, and invite him to a feast tonight. But what about the trial? I said with concern. Marcellus looked from one face to another. What trial? Octavia explained what had been happening in the forum, and how this morning a verdict would be given on Tullia's fate. I don't know. Marcellus looked at Julia. I was rather hoping to spend some time at home. And we can send a slave to hear the verdict, Julia added. But you were the one who suggested going, I exclaimed. Aren't you interested in what happens to her? Sure, but Marcellus just returned, Celine. He's tired. He didn't look tired to me. And probably hungry. Starving, he groaned. I looked from Julia to Marcellus and wondered how I could ever have believed that Marcellus had the compassion to be the Red Eagle. I'll go with you, my brother said swiftly. I'm happy to go as well, Lucius warned. Not by yourselves, Vitruvius warned. I can take them. Octavia turned to Juba. But you've only just returned, she protested. Aren't you tired? Perhaps if we hadn't stopped at every inn along the way, he said, looking meaningfully at Marcellus, I would be more road-weary. As it is, I feel quite rested. Besides, the princess seems to have a soft spot for slaves, and I'm interested to see which victim has inflamed her sympathy this time. I crossed my arms over my chest, and my brother's look warned me not to say anything that might cause Juba to withdraw his offer. Then you must be careful, Octavia cautioned. The plebes are extremely angry about this. You aren't coming? I asked. Octavia looked uncomfortable. I believe I will spend this day with Marcellus. In the end, only 4 of us went, and Lucius conversed cheerfully with Juba along the way. So are the Gauls as barbaric as they say? He asked eagerly. Look around. Half of Rome is filled with them. But in their native lands, do they really feast on men's flesh and walk naked through the woods? Not that I've seen, Juba replied. But their horses are finer than anything in Rome, my brother said. That's true, isn't it? Yes, Juba said. They train them better, and the steeds seem to be of better quality. You know their goddess Epona is a horse. I notice you don't make fun of that, I remarked. Juba smiled. That's because everyone knows the Gauls are barbarians. The Egyptians, on the other hand, are reputed to be fine thinkers. And was the weather as terrible as Augustus wrote? Lucius asked. Octavia read us letters that talked of snow falling for weeks. The Gallic mountains are forbidding, Juba admitted. Hundreds of soldiers died, and many more would have followed if the rebellion had lasted. Wounds that may be survivable in the summer drain the body differently in winter. So how did Augustus survive it? I asked. He left after a month of rain. He left? Alexander repeated incredulously. Where? To the northeast of Iberia, at a place called Tarraco. And I suspect that's where he'll remain until his generals finish the Cantabrian War. My brother stopped walking. Then he isn't fighting? No, Juba said simply. Augustus was not built for warfare. Alexander looked at me, then continued moving, and I could hear his thoughts as clearly as if he were speaking them aloud. Our father, who had never been sick a day in his life, had died so that a weakling could rule an empire he couldn't even defend personally. Our mother would have clothed herself in deerskin and eaten strips of human flesh before leaving her soldiers hungry and cold in the mountains of Gaul. She would have donned armor herself and fought like a man before turning and fleeing for warmer climes. So this is it, Juba said as we arrived in the forum, the latest trial to stir up the passion of the plebes and Princess Selene. Oh, my goodness. I ignored his taunt, and he led us to our regular place behind the platform. Because we were early, the Judases had only just begun seating themselves, but a swarm of spectators already filled the courtyard. The lawyers for Aquila and Tullia mounted the rostrum, and the girl at the center of the trial was brought out, with 2 soldiers for guards. Her face was stained with tears, and she was trembling. I searched for her mother and father in the crowd and saw them closest to the platform, smiling and encouraging her to be strong. I turned to Juba. Do you think it's funny now? You mistake me, he said coldly. This has never been funny. Just a sad, short spectacle of human injustice like most other trials this courtyard has witnessed. I stepped back. Then you hope she will go free? If what Octavia has told me about this trial is true, then yes. I am sorry if this disappoints you. I know how you cherish the thought that I am indifferent to human suffering. I looked back at the lawyers, who were wearing long cloaks in case of rain. The 2 men waited patiently to begin, and when the last of the Judases were seated, the lawyer for Tullia addressed them. He made a plea for reason and sanity, asking that the seated men remember their own daughters, sisters, and wives. Then Aquila's lawyer spoke on behalf of his client, reminding the Judases of Aquila's reputation as the Aventine's most reputable banker. There were jeers from the crowd as he said this, but no one attempted to rush the platform or throw food. Hundreds of soldiers stood in formation around the forum, and when the Judases rose, there was total silence. Aquila, the first Judex announced. Aquila, said the second, and the third said the same. What does it mean? I whispered. They are voting in favor of the banker, Juba said, and we are about to witness what plebeian rage looks like. The soldiers around us began to tense as one by one the Judases stood and announced for Aquila. Perhaps we should leave, I said uneasily. Some of them have to be in favor in Tullia, Alexander exclaimed. They can't all be bought. But Judex after Judex rose and said Aquila. The crowd was becoming volatile, shouting insults and threatening revenge. But as the last Judex rose, the courtyard fell silent. Aquila, the old man said, and suddenly Tullia rushed past the rostrum into her father's arms. But instead of laying her head upon his chest, she fell to her knees and exposed her neck. It happened so swiftly that even the guards were taken by surprise. Then shrill screams echoed across the forum as the plebes realized what had happened. The centurion had killed his own daughter in order to save her from slavery and rape. Lucius covered his mouth with his hand, and even Juba looked pale. We didn't wait to see what would happen. I had seen plebeian anger at the Circus Maximus and the trial of Gaius Fabius's slaves, but this was an outrage on a different scale. Juba took my arm, and Alexander and Lucius followed swiftly behind us. Move! Juba shouted at the people around us. Move! By the time we reached the Palatine, a fleet-footed slave had already told Octavia what had happened, and dozens of people were gathered on Augustus's platform, watching the conflict in the forum. Something was burning in the courtyard of the Senate, and I presumed it was the rostrum where Tullia's father had killed her rather than let her be violated. The small flecks of scarlet darting in and out of the forum had to be soldiers attempting to put out the fire, but small fires had already started up in other places. They're burning their own livelihoods, Tiberius said scornfully. They don't care, I told him. They're sending a message to the Senate. And what is that? He demanded. That the plebes can't be trusted to watch an open trial? that from now on the trials should be held in secret? She was alive, Julia said plaintively. Just yesterday. She was alive. Agrippa looked murderous, and I wondered if he was thinking of his daughter Vipsania. I should have gone today. It wouldn't have changed anything, Vitruvius assured him. The Judases were bought. Octavia remained silent, watching the small fires burn across the forum. One by one they were being put out, but the sound of the raging mobs was carried on the wind. Do you think her father will be charged with murder? I asked no one in particular. She was the property of Aquila, Juba replied, his slave. If he wished to ask for money in reparation, he may. Someone should kill him in his sleep, Julia hissed. He should be slaughtered the way Tullia's father slaughtered her. The young slave girl Faustina approached Octavia with hesitant steps. Domina, the cook says the feast is ready. It's too soon, Octavia snapped, and the girl flinched. I had never heard Octavia raise her voice to a slave. We can watch the fires burn or go inside, Vitruvius said. Either way, the girl is gone. It wasn't a merry homecoming. What was supposed to be a festive celebration in honor of Marcellus's return with Tiberius and Juba became a subdued meal. Magister Varius and Gallia joined us in the triclinium, and there was a purposeful silence about what was happening below the Palatine. But after a little music and several courses of wine, Marcellus described for us his feats in battle, and Tiberius even honored us with a poem composed after a bloody clash. I heard my brother whisper to Lucius that he could have done much better, and when Marcellus saw the intimacy between them, he looked at me. I smiled helplessly, and when he nodded, I wondered how long he had known about Alexander. So tell me about Rome, Marcellus said to me. There was not much to tell, only that the Pantheon was nearly done, and that building had begun on his theatre a month ago. Shall we see it tomorrow? Marcellus asked eagerly. You mean after the ludus? Octavia reminded. If Magister Varius hadn't been there, I'm sure that Marcellus would have rolled his eyes. Instead, he smiled politely. Of course. So tell me, he added excitedly to Vitruvius, what does it look like? Vitruvius smiled. Don't ask me. Ask Celine. She is your architect. Really? Didn't you say the design should be left up to her? Vitruvius asked. Marcellus grinned. So? It looks like the Circus Maximus, I said. He slapped his knee, and I'm sure I felt my heart expanding. There's 3 stories of arches, and the columns in the Corinthian style. Is it big enough to hold races? Marcellus! Octavia reprimanded. But everyone laughed, and when the evening was finished, and even turned it over in my mind the next morning while I should have been concentrating on what Vitruvius was teaching me. But when a commotion erupted in the atrium, I forgot about Juba entirely. I looked up at Vitruvius, and he rose from his chair. Is someone shouting? I asked him. I don't know. We both went to see. On every basilica, Faustina was saying, an actum as long as your stola, and news that Aquila has been murdered. In his sleep? I cried, thinking of Julia's request. No, she turned to me, on the Aventine, left for dead like a pig, and not a single person willing to come forward as a witness. Is it any wonder? Octavia whispered. My brother and Lucius hurried into the atrium. What is it? Lucius looked to his father. Plebeian justice, Vitruvius replied. There were 7 more acta between the time of Tullia's trial and our progress to Capri in July. Agrippa's soldiers stood guard at every temple and basilica in Rome, so the rebel began posting on the windows of merchants' shops, making those shops instantly popular with the plebes. And when the merchants were threatened with imprisonment, he posted his next actum on the heavy cedar doors of Augustus's villa. The sheet was taken down before any of us could read it, but enough slaves had seen it on Augustus's door to send the story spreading like fire throughout the city. I could see the relief on Octavia's face when the summer finally came, and she could escape the plebeian hostility for Capri. She'd said nothing to me about her charity in the Suburra, but Vitruvius admitted that at some homes people had begun to turn away her help, preferring to beg or steal for their food than receive it from a patrician. As our ship sailed from Naples to the little island where Augustus's sea palace rose from the docks, Alexander turned to me. I wonder if the Red Eagle is following us. I looked from the rails to Octavia and Vitruvius, who were sitting on the deck, shaded from the sun by a thin linen canopy. Every home on Capri will be searched if he dares to post anything there again, I told him. I wouldn't be surprised if they have soldiers in disguise across the island, waiting for him to make a mistake. It didn't work in Rome. Rome isn't an island, my brother said. But after a week of sun-bleached days spent lounging in the sea palace, there was no sign of the rebel, and the men of the Praetorian Guard began to relax at their posts. They tossed dice, ate fish, and were willing to place bets on nearly anything, from the fastest-moving boats passing on the sea to the height of a palm tree. Without Augustus or Olivia to watch us, there was almost nothing we couldn't do. Even Tiberius and Drusus enjoyed themselves a little, joining us on Marcellus's daily boat trips to the Blue Grotto, where Roman patricians had turned the sea cave into their own bathing pool. The walls were painted with images of Neptune rising from the waves, and small statues of the bearded sea god rested in niches carved into the rock. Toward the end of the summer, when Claudia became adventurous enough to come along, both Agrippa and Juba paddled with us to the cave. "What do you think makes the water so blue?" Claudia asked. It was as if something was lighting the sea from underneath, turning the water the brilliant shade of cornflowers. "It's the opening down there," Juba said from the boat, pointing to a gap in the rock that was completely submerged. "That's where the sunlight enters and lights the water from below." "First in!" Marcellus shouted, tearing off his tunic and diving into the water in his loincloth. Claudia immediately averted her gaze, but Tiberius and Drusus stripped off their tunics and dove overboard too. "Aren't you coming?" Drusus called to Vipsania. She stood at the edge of the boat. "It looks a little cold." "Nonsense!" Lucius exclaimed. "Let's go!" He pushed Julia and Vipsania from the boat before they had time to take off their clothes, and Alexander followed. "Are you going in?" I asked Claudia, stowing my sandals in the prow of the little boat where they wouldn't get wet. "In my breastband and loincloth?" "Why not?" I took off my tunic. "We come here every day." She looked uneasily at Agrippa and Juba, who were already swimming. "Go," I persisted. "Your husband doesn't mind. Look at Vipsania. Do you think he would let his daughter do something dishonorable?" Claudia hesitated, then took off her tunic and slowly, timidly dipped her foot into the water. "What are you waiting for?" Marcellus cried, pulling her in. "Marcellus!" she shrieked, but once she was completely wet, she giggled. "It's warm in here, like bath water." "You see," I told her, "it's not so bad." I slipped over the side of the boat and swam up to Marcellus. Immediately, Julia was at my side. "Can you imagine being here at high tide?" Claudia asked worriedly. "The water would rise and we'd all be trapped." "It's not high tide for another few hours," Marcellus said. "Besides," Julia added, "there's a secret path over there to the mountain." She indicated the end of the cave, where a limestone platform led to a series of steps. "Have you ever used it?" Julia shook her head. "Then how can you be sure it works?" "Because we saw a goat come through it once." Claudia looked to her brother to confirm the story. "It's true," Marcellus said. "Ask Agrippa if you don't believe me." She swam away to her husband, and Julia said critically, "She's so nervous." "Like all my sisters," Marcellus said. Why do you think Antonia and Tonia aren't here?" "Because your mother forbids it?" Julia guessed. Marcellus shook his head. "So long as I'm with them, they're welcome to come, but they're afraid. They'd rather be playing their lyres or planting boxwood in the garden." Anyone betting on the Eagle? Take your bets. We've still got a little bit of story to finish before we find out who it is. Julia wrinkled her nose. "How boring." "They're like my mother," Marcellus observed. "They enjoy the quiet, simple pleasures." And there was something very endearing about their simplicity that evening while everyone played dice in the summer triclinium. Neither Antonia nor Tonia gambled, and Vipsania and Drusus were deemed too young to play. So the four of them sat together on a couch, quietly watching the roll of the dice. Only Alexander, Lucius, and Julia remained in the game. Marcellus whispered eager tips to Julia, and once in a while Juba or Agrippa would look up from their reading to see who was winning. Julia rolled, and Lucius exclaimed, "4 vultures!" She groaned. "I'm finished." "But no one's thrown a Venus," Lucius protested. "The next roll could be yours." "It's always the next roll with you two. You can keep my denarii in the pot." "Your loss," my brother said temptingly, but she didn't care. He and Lucius battled it out, and by the time Lucius won, I realized that Marcellus and Julia had disappeared. I looked around the triclinium. Where did Marcellus go? "With Julia," Tonia said, "out to the gardens. I think they're sitting in the gazebo." "Which one?" "Near the statue of Fortuna. Would you like me to show it to you?" "Leave them alone," Juba said, looking up from his reading. "They've gone there for a reason." "And how do you know?" "I have eyes." I rose swiftly from my chair, and Tonia asked eagerly, "Would you like me to show you?" "Yes," I said stubbornly. "You're wasting your time." Juba's voice grew irritable. "If you think you're in love with him, you're no different than any of the girls at the roadside inns. Besides, it's Julia he's meant for." "So everyone says." "So Augustus says." When Juba saw me pause, he added, "The letter came today. Octavia will probably announce it tomorrow." Tonia was still looking up at me. Her small hand reached out toward mine. "Shall we go?" For a moment I didn't answer. Then, when the mist finally cleared from my mind, I told her, "Just take me to the baths." Tonia chatted about silly things along the way, what color the flowers should be on her balcony, and which food I liked better, thrush or quail. She wanted to know if I'd ever seen the animal called a giraffe, and told me that I should visit her uncle's zoo in Rome as soon as we returned. Nothing she talked about was of any importance. She spoke only about simple, insignificant things, and for that I couldn't have been more thankful. But when Octavia gathered us all in the triclinium the next morning, and announced that she had wonderful news from Iberia, my heart sank in my chest, and I wished I could have a simple life as Tonia. Instead, I had spent the night hoping that Juba had been wrong, that he had only told me such things to try and torment me. But now, Marcellus's long-awaited marriage to Julia was going to be made a reality, and Augustus wanted Agrippa to take his place in the ceremony on the auspicious day of December 24th. As soon as Octavia spoke the words, my brother looked at me, and Lucius patted my arm in an understanding gesture. For the next 4 months I would have to be cheerful and happy for Julia, and there would be a dozen things she would want me to help her with. Tunics and cloaks, new sandals and bridal jewels. There was more news as well, but I hardly heard it. Marcellus was to be honored by being made an aedile, in charge of Rome's public entertainments for an entire year, which would mean access to nearly unlimited funds in order to impress the plebes. When Tiberius heard this, he sat back in his seat and groaned. "I hope Augustus knows what he's doing." But the final news made time stop entirely. In honor of his service to Rome, Juba, Prince of Numidia, and unswerving friend of Augustus, was being made King of Mauritania. It would be a client kingship in which he served the purposes of Rome, but even so, Mauritania adjoined his ancestral land of Numidia, where his father and grandfather had ruled before him. I met my brother's gaze across the table, and while everyone celebrated the happy news, Alexander seated himself next to me. "You see," I whispered in Parthian, "if it can happen for Juba, it can happen for us." "Yes, but he's 22, and he spent his life being useful to Augustus, serving him, protecting him, fighting alongside him. What have I done?" "Nothing, but you haven't been given the chance. At least you have your work with Vitruvius." I was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps that will be enough for us both." We looked across the triclinium at Juba, who was being congratulated by Agrippa and Claudia. "As soon as you're comfortable in your new palace," Agrippa was promising him, "we plan on making the journey south for a visit." But Juba laughed. "I don't expect I'll be leaving any time soon. There's the matter of a war in Cantabria to finish. I'm not sure how Augustus would feel about returning home to discover that I'd left him." Julia and Marcellus were by themselves on the farthest couch in the triclinium, and I could see that she was weeping. He kissed the tears of happiness from her cheeks in a way that made my heart ache, and I reminded myself sternly, It's about continuing to study with Vitruvius so that Augustus will let me return to Egypt. It's not about falling in love with a Roman, however winsome he is. But it was difficult to remember what I had left to hope for as Julia dragged me to every shop in the Forum in search for the perfect bridal clothes. There had been a message from Iberia that whatever Julia wished for her wedding should be ordered, and that every senator in Rome would be invited to the celebration. "Look at all of this cloth," Julia complained in November, with only a month left before her marriage. "Wool, linen, heavy winter silks. How can any of these be used for a veil?" We had gone to shop after shop looking for something suitable, but she'd found nothing. She sat down on the shopkeeper's chair while the old man scurried around us, presenting us with options. "There has to be something," Lucius protested. "What about that red stuff over there?" "It's too thick." My brother held up a swath of red silk. "Too shiny," she ruled. "There are no more shops," Gallia reminded her. "What about inviting the merchants from Ostia to the Palatine?" "She's already done that," I said dryly. "Then how about choosing something from the 100 shops we've already been to?" Marcellus suggested. Julia's eyes filled with tears. "You don't care what I wear," she stood angrily. "I could show up in a peasant's palla, and it wouldn't matter at all." Marcellus exchanged a wearied look with me. "You're right, it wouldn't." He went to her. "Because what matters to me isn't the veil." He lifted her chin tenderly. "It's you." Alexander whispered in Parthian, "You have to feel a little sorry for him. This is what the rest of his life is going to be like." Julia calmed a little, but the crisis of the veil wasn't resolved until 8 days before the wedding, as we were bidding Magister Varius farewell. Our days in the ludus were finished. Beginning with the new year, Alexander and Lucius were going to join Marcellus and Tiberius in a separate school for rhetoric, where they would learn how to speak in public and argue law cases. Julia would be in charge of her own house, a magnificent villa near Agrippa's on the Palatine, and instead of studying Homer or Virgil, she would be holding her own salutatio, doing charity work and commissioning buildings in her own name. Because school was finished for me as well, Vitruvius paid me the honor of asking whether I wished to study with him in the daytime and oversee some of the work on the theater. Agrippa's Pantheon and the new basilica being built in honor of Julia's marriage. Only this time, when he asked, it was not because Octavia pressured him to. The 6 of us waved goodbye to Magister Varius, and though Julia was the one who had enjoyed the ludus least, she blinked back tears as we crossed the courtyard toward Juba and Gallia for the very last time. Though Juba was king of a foreign land now, and could have left our security to the Praetorian Guard, it was a mark of his loyalty to Augustus that he remained as Marcellus's personal protector. Julia sniffed loudly, and when Marcellus gave her his linen square, she used it to dab at her eyes. "You know what this means, don't you?" she wailed. "Our childhood has passed," Alexander said quietly. "Who cares about our childhood?" she said heatedly. "There are only 8 days to find cloth for a veil." Marcellus gave Julia a desperate look. "Why don't you go shopping with Celine?" he suggested. "Juba can take us back—" "We've been to every store," I interrupted. "There's nowhere in Rome we haven't gone." Julia's look was miserable. Everything was ready. Her handsomely embroidered cloak of red and gold, a tunic woven from the finest silk, her pearl-encrusted sandals, her bangles, her underclothes. Only the veil remained. Marcellus looked as if he were about to weep himself. And then I remembered. "I think I have something. In the chest I brought from Alexandria, some swaths of red silk." Julia gasped, "Can we see them?" I glanced at Marcellus, who smiled me with the deepest gratitude, and I was forced to admit to myself that my revelation was not entirely altruistic. "Of course." Marcellus exhaled audibly. "I'll bet Celine has something that would be absolutely perfect." Julia shot him a look, but when we returned to the Palatine and I opened the chest that had been locked for more than 4 years, she reached forward for the first swath of silk and exclaimed, "This is it!" It was the material left over from a chiton I had worn to my mother's last feast. It had been the feast of the inseparable in death, when my parents had invited everyone who had been close to them to dine one last time. I hesitated, wondering whether or not I should tell her. "You probably don't want that one," I said finally, but she had already draped it over her head. "Why not?" "Because it was the cloth I wore to my mother's last dinner." "The feast of a queen," Julia whispered, regarding herself in the mirror. The red contrasted beautifully with her mass of black hair, and she didn't care what the material had been for. "It might bring you bad luck." "Nonsense," she said. "That's only superstition." "Your father wouldn't think so." "And do I look like him?" No. She looked like the most beautiful bride who would ever be carried across the threshold of a villa. Pearls imported from the Indian Sea gleamed on her dark neck, and in 8 days, when her hair was dressed in similar ornaments, Marcellus would be the envy of every man in Rome. I let her take the silk, but as she was folding it into a neat square for her seamstress, she sat down on my bathing-room chair, and tears began to well in her eyes. "What's the matter?" I exclaimed. "You have your veil. Everything is ready." She nodded, as if she knew it was foolish to cry. "I know." "Then what's wrong?" She looked up at me, and her dark eyes suddenly appeared enormous, as if they belonged to a child. "She won't be there," she whispered, and immediately I was ashamed of my resentment. No one in the world knew Julia better than Marcellus. Her father, her stepmother, even her stepbrother, only cared what happened to her so long as it advanced their will. In a world of pretty silks and pearls, where everything was theater, Marcellus was her only real happiness, and her mother wouldn't even be able to meet him on the wedding day. I took a seat next to her and offered her my hand. There was nothing I could say, so instead we sat together in silence, and I thought of how selfish a friend I had been. Ishmael, the wife. Whose wife? Caesar's wife? The excitement of Julia's wedding didn't stop me from wallowing in my own misery in private. Though I put a smile on my face and helped Julia with everything a bride might need, packing her chests, choosing her perfume, finding the right silk tunic for her wedding night, I still felt an empty ache in my heart when Marcellus looked at me, or I heard him laugh in his mother's villa, and knew it would be one of the last times I would ever have that sound wake me in the morning. Livia. I think you mean Livia. Yet Marcellus was bursting with happiness. He was marrying a woman he loved, and who loved him back. There would be spectacles and entertainments to plan for an entire year, and before long Augustus would make him consul and officially name him the future emperor of Rome. 2 nights before the wedding, Marcellus crept into my chamber, where Alexander, Lucius, and I were whispering about the war in Cantabria, and how it might be many years before we'd have to see Livia's sour face again. Since the announcement of his wedding, he had stopped coming to us, and I presumed from the nightly creaking of his window that he was visiting Julia instead. But he took up his old position on the 3rd couch, and my brother asked eagerly, "Well, what's it like to be getting married?" Marcellus smiled. "Wonderful. Frightening." "How can it be frightening?" I teased. "Well, think of the responsibility," he said. "Now that there will be a house to maintain and slaves to buy, and—" "You're not really going to buy slaves!" I exclaimed. "Of course he is," Lucius said. "How else is his house going to run?" I stared at Marcellus. "I will treat them properly," he promised swiftly. "I would never, ever send them away for getting pregnant." "Or push them into an eel pool," I added, "or whip them for broken dishes." "Certainly not." I crossed my arms over my chest. "Will you pay them?" He hesitated. Well, sure, why not? Every Saturnalia. They can all receive presents. Julia can take care of that." "Why can't you?" "Because I'll be too busy planning the games." He grinned widely. "There's the Ludi Plebii, the Ludi Apollinaris, the Ludi Megalonesis, and the Ludi Cerealis." He looked at my brother. "And you'll help me, won't you?" My brother couldn't have been more pleased with any request. They spoke at length about horses, and floats for parades, and which animals from Augustus's zoo would be the most likely to awe the plebes if they were used as part of the opening processions. Marcellus didn't speak again about marriage, but before he left, he paused at the door one last time and looked back. "Lucius and the twins," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I'll miss our nights together." When he shut the door and Lucius left, I turned on my side and faced the wall. Alexander knew enough to simply blow out the oil lamp. Then he kissed my hair and whispered that it would be better in the morning. But it wasn't. It was the last day of Saturnalia, with all of the shops in the Forum closed, and 100 different things still to be arranged. There was the matter of the food, and reminders had to be sent across Rome to the homes of butchers and bakers to ensure that the proper amounts would be delivered the next morning. Wine, honey, vinegar, and garum had to be available in considerable quantities, and despite the fact that it was a holiday, merchants arrived throughout the day with heavy chests and barrels. Nothing more important than this wedding would ever happen beneath Octavia's roof, so the slaves rushed from room to room with wash buckets and brooms, using feather dusters on the most delicate statues, and ladders to reach the highest mosaics. Marcellus went to spend the day with Julia, and when Alexander asked whether I'd like to join him and Lucius at the Odeum, I shook my head. "What will you do, then? Sit out here on the portico and feel sorry for yourself? It's cold," he protested. "Come to the Odeum. There will be warm beer and ofele." "I'm fine. Besides, there's work to be done in the theater." "Over Saturnalia? Even Vitruvius isn't working." "There's just a few things I'd like to see to," I lied. "It's important." But my brother knew me better. "Celine, you care more about that theater than Marcellus does. He'll probably step inside it once." "That doesn't matter," I said angrily. "It's my project. Vitruvius gave it to me, and I'll see that it's done right. Work doesn't stop just because it's a silly Roman festival." I convinced Octavia to let me go, and 2 praetorians were sent with me to Marcellus's theater. I took my book of sketches, although, truthfully, there was nothing I planned to sketch. I simply wanted a place away from the madness of preparations, a place where I could sit one last time to remember how simple life had been before engagements and weddings and bitter envy. We crossed through the Forum Holatorium, where the vegetable stalls were shut for Saturnalia, and though the guards wanted to take the short cut, I refused, thereby avoiding the Columna Lactaria, where Horatia's daughter had been abandoned. This winter hadn't brought any snow, but gray clouds curtained the sun, casting a pall over the city and darkening the streets. When we arrived, I could see that the guards were worried about rain. There was only one umbraculum between us, so they gave it to me and waited beneath the arches while I inspected the empty theater. A great deal of work had been completed since the building's conception. The cavea, where more than 10,000 spectators could sit, the stage, which would soon be covered in mosaic, and the 3 tiers of arches supported by columns in each of the Greek architectural styles, first Doric, then Ionic, and finally Corinthian. Every day for nearly a year I had come here, whether with either Vitruvius or the guards, and watched the men build. I had been allowed to choose the artwork and mosaics, and the workers knew better than to slight me, since Vitruvius made it clear that I was as important to this theater as Marcellus himself. I walked to the stage and ran my hand along its edge. The wood had been smoothed to perfection, and when I was sure that there were no splinters, I seated myself so that I looked out to the cavea. Years of hard labor would be required to complete the rest of the theater. Builders would grow from boys to men here, as I had grown from a girl to a woman in the time since it had started. I thought of my excitement when Marcellus first asked Augustus whether I could help in its creation. I'd believed it was Marcellus's way of showing special favor to me, and it had been, only not the kind I'd imagined. He didn't really care about this theater, and tomorrow he would take Julia as his bride. She would press her soft cheek against his chest as he carried her into their villa, and once he untied her girdle, their new life would begin. I could feel the sting of tears beginning in my eyes. Then a figure appeared at the back of the theater, and I stood swiftly. "What are you doing here?" I exclaimed. Juba smiled as he advanced. I saw the guards and thought there might be trouble inside. I didn't realize you had come to cry out your sorrows, but I suppose that every tragedy deserves a stage." "I'm not crying," I said sternly. Juba raised his brows. "My mistake. I came here to make some final plans. This area," I said unconvincingly, "still needs a mosaic." I stepped down and strode purposefully past him, and then it occurred to me. "I know why you're here," I gasped. "Augustus wants you to spy on me." Juba laughed at my foolishness. "Do you really imagine that I have so little to do with my time?" "Then why aren't you packing, leaving for Mauritania on the next ship?" Immediately I regretted my words. He stepped back and said quietly, "Perhaps I still have business in Rome, like making sure my slaves have a place to go when I'm gone." He moved to join the guards, and the three of them talked about the war in Cantabria, completely ignoring me. When I finally asked to be taken back to the Palatine, the four of us walked the short distance in silence. It was a wedding that even the wealthiest merchants would be talking about for many years. Thousands of people filled the villa from the triclinium to the gardens, where charcoal braziers kept away the winter's chill, and lanterns lit the rose-trimmed paths. Between every column, swaths of the richest blue and gold silks fluttered in the breeze, and handsomely dressed slaves rushed between the senators, offering them cups of the best Chian wine. When Marcellus slid a gold and emerald ring onto Julia's finger, the thundering shouts of "Thalassa" on the rooftop were probably heard all the way down by the Circus Maximus. And the feast that followed lasted into the third watch. "It will be us next," my brother said ominously as we rested in the triclinium. His hair had taken on a burnished sheen in the soft light of the oil lamps, and I saw Lucius staring at him from across the room. "Perhaps Augustus will never return," I said. But my brother wasn't so hopeful. "Then Livia will take care to arrange it from Iberia. She sends Octavia letters every week, and you know what happens in 7 days." We would be turning 15. Alexander would prepare for his coming-of-age ceremony at the festival of Liberalia, and more men would be inquiring about my availability for marriage, since this was the age by which even the most restrictive fathers realized that they would have to let their daughters go. I twisted my napkin nervously in my hands. We both looked at Julia and Marcellus, laughing and happy in their newly wedded bliss. He had taken her up in his arms, and a long procession was forming to escort them into their new villa. As they passed our table, Julia's gaze met mine, and her smile faltered. I knew she was thinking about her mother. I stood up and pressed her hand. "Someday, when you're empress," I whispered. Her face brightened, and as Marcellus carried her away, I made a silent prayer to both Isis and Serapis that Julia would always be this happy. Time and again she had been kind to me, and I had repaid that kindness with jealousy. She had been denied the love and affection of her mother. Now, at least, she would have it from a husband. "Do you want to go with them?" I asked Alexander. "No, it will only be depressing," he said. Secretly, I was thankful. Although I was curious to see what her villa was like, I had no desire to watch Marcellus untie Julia's girdle, then lay her down on his bridal couch where men sang lewd songs and made grunting noises. "I'm going to go to sleep then," I told him. "Don't wait up for me." "But it's almost morning." My brother smiled. "And there's still a few amphorae of the Chian left." When I awoke that afternoon and looked across the chamber, I saw that Alexander's couch hadn't been slept on. Give me a second, let me go shut my door. Oh. Okay. It probably wasn't going to be noisy, but just in case. It was 3 days before we saw Marcellus and Julia again. They remained in their villa enjoying each other and their sudden freedom, and Marcellus didn't even attend school with the Rhetor, which sent his mother into a rare fit of rage. She burst into the library while Vitruvius was showing me formulas he had used to build the dome on the Pantheon. 3 days, she cried. He hasn't studied with the Rhetor in 3 days. We both looked up, and Octavia rubbed her temple. If this is a sign of things to come, he's a newlywed, Vitruvius pointed out calmly. I'm sure it's not a sign of anything but love. Octavia saw my face and mistook my pain for disapproval. You see, she exclaimed, Celine understands. That's why she comes here with you every day, when she could be shopping with Julia or studying Plato. I will warn him this evening. At his first feast? Vitruvius asked. He'll be playing the host. He can play at whatever he'd like, so long as he studies. Even from Iberia, Octavia warned, Livia keeps her eye on Rome. You think I don't know what her slaves are writing? And if Augustus should discover what Marcellus has been doing, lying in bed, watching the races from his balcony, don't think there aren't plenty of other choices for heir. Vitruvius gave a hollow laugh. Like who? Tiberius would rather be castrated. And what would Livia care? She would put him through the trials of Hercules if she thought it would bring him closer to power. When I'm finished speaking with Marcellus, she demanded, you must speak to him as well. Only after Vitruvius nodded gravely did she look down at the scroll we were working on. Is that the Pantheon? She asked. Yes. Celine and I are about to oversee the installation of the gods, and by the time your brother returns it will be finished. Then there's been news? I asked swiftly. I looked at Vitruvius and Octavia, but neither of them seemed inclined to answer. Only half of Cantabria has been subdued, Octavia said. The war may take another 6 months, even though he promised to be here for the unveiling. I can ask Agrippa whether he wishes to postpone it, Vitruvius said uncertainly. But Octavia shook her head. No, it wouldn't be right for such a great building to stand empty. Come with us, Vitruvius said imploringly. You haven't seen the construction in more than a year, and you can write to your brother about what's been completed. He'll be jealous, she smiled sadly. Agrippa tells me it's unlike anything that's ever been built. Vitruvius offered her his arm. You'll have to judge that for yourself. Octavia invited Gallia to come with us, and when we arrived, their eyes were drawn upward to the pediment, where sculptors had inscribed, Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul for the 3rd time, made this building. There was nothing unusual about the outside of the building. It was a colonnaded porch of simple concrete and brick, but as we passed through the great bronze doors into the Pantheon, I heard Gallia whisper something in her mother tongue. Nothing in the world had ever equaled it in beauty or grandeur, not even in Alexandria. From the rich marble flooring to the internal colonnades, light and color worked together to create something that had never been done before. The dome was decorated with octagonal and hexagonal shapes, making it appear like a honeycomb to anyone who was standing beneath it. In the center was a large, perfectly round opening, an oculus, which let in the only light. Gallia's gaze traveled from niche to niche, where workers were using oiled polishing cloths to prepare them for the reception of the marble statues. When she repeated her amazed sentiments in Gaulish, Juba stepped from the shadows and replied, It's impressive, isn't it? I looked at Vitruvius in surprise. He explained he has come to inspect the statues for flaws and authenticity. They only arrived this morning. Juba and Gallia spoke for a moment in her language. Then he turned and greeted Octavia and Vitruvius. But when it came to me, his voice was not so merry. I don't believe there are any mosaics that need finishing. I am here to take measurements for the statues, I retorted. He turned to Vitruvius. What? He asked with mock indignation. You didn't think I would consider that before buying them? Vitruvius looked genuinely apologetic, but Juba slapped his back good-naturedly. Of course, Juba laughed. There is no point in hauling a marble statue across the chamber if it's only going to be returned. He took Gallia and Octavia on a short tour of the building, and while they were busy, I helped Vitruvius take the measurements. I hoped desperately that one of the statues would be too tall or too wide for its niche, but frustratingly, Juba was right. They all fit. Well, Juba stood over me when we were finished. They're fine, I said shortly, rising and dusting my hands on my tunic. A perfect job, Vitruvius complimented, and very handsome sculptures, Juba. Are they all Roman? Only the Venus is Greek. For some reason I was drawn to her face. I looked across the Pantheon to the statue of Venus. Perhaps it was my own vanity that made me think I recognized her, but the nose and possibly the light, painted eyes were similar to mine. Then Gallia dropped her voice and whispered, "She reminds me of Caesar's mistress." "Tarantilla," Juba nodded. "Yes, perhaps you're right." That evening, I dressed more carefully than usual for Marcellus's first feast. I put on my favorite tunic of blue silk and a belt of silver cloth to match my sandals. Then Gallia arranged my hair in a handsome bun on the top of my head, using long silver pins to hold it in place. The result in the mirror was extremely pleasing, and even Gallia was impressed. She sprayed me with a blend of violet and jasmine. "You have turned into a real beauty," she said. "Hera herself would be jealous if she had to compete with you." I laughed. "How do you know that story? It's a Greek tale." "I read, and sometimes Magister Varius tells those tales to me." "Does he miss us?" I asked as we walked to the portico. "What do you think? He has Drusus and Vipsania now for students. They do not study much." Poor Magister Varius, I thought. He probably imagined that Julia and Marcellus were the laziest students he'd ever have to teach. My brother and Lucius were already on the portico, gambling with dice. "Don't you ever stop?" I teased. My brother looked up, and a smile touched his lips. "Nice." He rose to his feet. "Exceptionally nice," though he gave me a warning look. As we walked across the Palatine, I clenched and unclenched my hands. "So what do you think their villa will be like?" I asked. Alexander smirked. "Without any slaves? A mess." "Octavia will have lent them some," I said, "and I'm sure Julia took cooks from her father's house." "We'll see," he said eagerly as we came to their doorstep. A young slave I had seen in Octavia's villa answered. "Salvete," the girl said in greeting. The glow of the setting sun burnished the gold trim on her tunic, and I was certain it was a touch that Julia had added. She wanted even her servants to wear gold. "Please," she stepped aside, "come in." Our small party entered the vestibulum, and Claudia made noises of appreciation. The floor was made from white Carrara marble, and the elegant murals and stucco decorations had been polished to a shine. Although many people had been here on the night of the wedding, few had taken the time to study the architecture, and as the young girl led us through the atrium, I could see Vitruvius appraising every niche and alcove. The judgment he passed must have been favorable, since he looked at Octavia and smiled. When we reached the triclinium, Marcellus and Julia rose from their couch, and Alexander whispered, "Look at the tables." They were made from cedar wood and inlaid with both jasper and ivory. "Welcome, mother," Marcellus said jubilantly. "So?" he asked eagerly. "How do you like it?" "Beautiful," she admitted. "All the marble and light, especially in the atrium. Julia is going to buy the rest of her furniture tomorrow. We still need a lararium and couches for the guest rooms. Please sit wherever you'd like." I had been worried about what the seating arrangements would be, but they were the same as for every other evening on the Palatine. Octavia sat with her daughter and son-in-law, and Vitruvius and Juba joined them. Drusus and Vipsania ate with Antonia and Tonia at their own small table, while the rest of us sat with Julia and Marcellus. "Your own villa," I said enviously. "So what is it like?" "Wonderful," Julia gushed. "No one to tell you what to do, or when to wake up, or where to go." "And the pool overlooks the circus," Marcellus added. "It's too cold for it now, even though it's heated, but in the spring you're all welcome to come." "It must be quiet in Augustus's villa without me," Julia said. Tiberius raised his brows. "Yes, there's no one to pick on now but the slaves." She laughed, and I thought, already marriage has changed her. She never would have let him have the last word before. "And have you seen the upstairs?" Julia asked me. "No, not yet. There's an entire room just for bathing, and a chamber that looks out over the forum. Come," she stood, "let me show you around." "But what about your guests?" She waved her hand dismissively. "They won't miss me during the gustaccio. Let them have a few drinks and some oysters." She took me up the stairs and pointed out the small details that she knew I would like: the onyx floor with its sleek fur rugs, the insets of blue and yellow marble on the ceilings, The tapestries, draperies, and awnings all looked new, and I asked her, who owned this villa before? Some old man who died without children. My father bought it for me 6 months ago, and had all of the tasteless furniture removed. You should have seen what was here. Only now there are no tables, and almost nothing to sleep on. I saw what she meant. In the bridal chamber, although the windows were beautiful and the floor had been polished, there was only a single couch. Julia saw my look and crossed her arms over her chest. It's worse than my father's villa, isn't it? Even the Vestals live better than this. I was forced to agree with her. Come with me tomorrow, she begged. We'll go shopping in the Forum. I have to work with Vitruvius. What, every day? No one has a better eye for design than you. I hesitated. Please, he'll understand. Just tell him your next project is going to be my villa. The next morning we set out for the Forum. Alexander came with us, shadowed by 2 praetorians, and Julia remarked, I'm surprised you're not with Lucius. I can't remember the last time I saw the 2 of you apart. My brother wrapped himself tighter in his cloak. Although no rain had fallen yet, the wind was bitter. He's with his father. He wants to show him some things he's written and ask for his opinion on finding a patron. He looked at me. Do you think there's any hope? I don't see why not. It's not as though Vitruvius doesn't have a patron himself. Yes, but it's Octavia, and he's sleeping with her. We were hoping for a patron who's content simply with art. Has he tried Virgil? Julia asked, or Horace? They both have more than a dozen writers whom they help fund, and Maecenas is interested only in Ovid. Then why can't we be his patron? Julia asked suddenly. Marcellus and I are married, and now both of us have our own funds. My brother stopped walking. Really? Why not? Octavia has her writers, and it's probably time that I have mine. My brother laughed. Lucius will be absolutely beside himself. There's only one condition, Julia stipulated. In all of his work, I want to be young and pretty, even when I'm old and fat. Eternally beautiful, my brother said. Duly noted. When we reached the shops along the Via Sacra, Julia wanted to go into them all. By the afternoon we had chosen nearly everything she would ever need. Chairs and chests made of citron wood, tripods with heavy bronze basins for incense and whose legs were decorated with griffins' heads and claws, tables made of rosewood, ivory-handled mirrors, hip baths in the shapes of sea dragons and swans. Your villa's going to be like the royal palace of Alexandria, my brother promised. Really? She asked eagerly. Prettier, I said, though it disturbed me that I was beginning to forget what the rooms in the palace had looked like. Sometimes when I took out my book of sketches and flipped through the pages, I was reminded of a chamber I'd forgotten entirely, or an alcove where Alexander and I had played as children. Sometimes I wondered how much Alexander remembered, but I was afraid of asking and upsetting him. All right, Julia announced. Just one more thing. A tapestry for the atrium. We followed her into a shop near the Senate, and Alexander nodded appreciatively. Impressive. On the walls hung tapestries and marble plaques depicting every sort of mythological scene. On one tapestry, Odysseus navigated his ship past the cliffs of Scylla. On another, Romulus and Remus fought about the walls of Rome. My brother stood immediately in front of a plaque depicting the Greek twins, the Gemini. Like our mother used to call us, he said quietly. We should buy this for our room. Absolutely not. It's too expensive. Then let me buy it for you, Julia said. When I started to object, she shook her head sternly. In 3 days, it will be your birthday, and this can be my gift. Julia, this is too generous, I protested. After all you did for me for my wedding? Nonsense, she said, and snapped her fingers. The man behind the counter came over at once, and when Julia pointed to the marble plaque, his eyes went wide. Have this sent to Octavia's villa, she instructed. You know the place? Of course, Domina. And you see that tapestry of Venus and Vulcan? That should go to the house of Julia Augusti. This is a very kind present, my brother said. Between this and Lucius's patronage, I don't see how we can ever leave Rome. She grinned. Good. When Livia returns, I'll need trustworthy friends on the Palatine. We got this much left, kids. On the morning of our 15th birthday, Alexander woke me with a kiss. Felicem diem natalem, Celine. I bolted upright. What's the matter? What? Alexander laughed. Nothing. I'm wishing you a happy birthday. Julia and Marcellus are here. They want to take us to the circus and then to the theater. Already? What time is it? Almost noon. Good thing you weren't meeting Vitruvius today. You must have had too much wine last night. My brother grinned. We had stayed up long past midnight, laughing and talking, but most importantly, helping Marcellus plan for the Ludi Megalensis. I rushed into a heavy tunic and cloak, sweeping up my hair into a loose bun, and while I dressed, Alexander regarded the handsome marble plaque of the Gemini. Do you really think the war will be over in 6 months? He asked worriedly. I hope not. The longer Augustus stays in Iberia, the better for everyone. There was a knock at the door, and Alexander called brightly, Come in! I'd expected Julia or Marcellus, but it was Octavia who appeared, carrying honeyed cakes and a letter. I glanced at Alexander. He touched the bulla around his neck. While I would wear mine until the day of my marriage, he would offer his to the Lares today. As long as we wore our bulle, we were no threat to anyone. But what would Augustus do with us now? Felicem diem natalem, Octavia exclaimed. 15 years old and a new year before you. She set the cakes down and smiled. I hear that my son is taking you to the circus. That doesn't seem like much of a treat for Celine. I smiled briefly. We were going to the theater afterward. Marcellus says it will be a comedy. I looked at the letter in her hand. From my brother, she said meaningfully. 7 came yesterday. 1 was for Agrippa, and a few are for her generals in his army. But this one, she said, taking a spot on the 3rd couch where Marcellus used to sit, might interest you. Perhaps you'd like to hear it? Alexander looked at me, and both of us nodded. Octavia unfurled the scroll and read, On this, the 15th year of their birth, I hope you will wish the Gemini well. There is nothing nearly as momentous as the passing from childhood to adulthood, and it is an occasion that merits serious consideration. When I return, it will be my foremost duty to see that a good marriage is made. Be sure to warn the Princess Celine, so that when the time comes, she has made herself ready. Octavia looked up at me with a triumphant smile. That's it? I panicked. What about Alexander? What about our return to Egypt? Her smile faltered. I'm sure that will all come in time. My brother's still at war. When he returns, but why does he have to wait? When Gallus committed suicide, I challenged Augustus named a new prefect while he was still in Gaul. That was a different situation, she said uneasily. For now, we should celebrate this news. Another wedding. Alexander reached for my hand. And what if we don't want to be married? He asked. Octavia frowned. Every girl wishes to marry at least once, and what man doesn't want to take a wife? We don't, I said. Alexander and I enjoy each other's company, and I don't see any reason why we should part. Octavia lowered the letter to her lap. But this is good news, Celine. You'll have a house of your own, like Julia and Marcellus. Who love each other, I protested. You know better than anyone what comes of an unwanted marriage. She flinched, and though I regretted hurting her, it was the truth. And what will Alexander do, I asked, given to a girl he doesn't even know? Most husbands don't know their wives. It's an arrangement that we don't want. She sat back, shocked by my reaction. But clearly Augustus had known, otherwise he wouldn't have warned her to prepare me. We shall discuss this in a few months, she said, but I see no reason why the two of you should have to be parted, simply because you'll be married. What if one of us goes to Egypt, and the other to Greece? Or what if Alexander isn't sent to Egypt at all, and we're sent to live at opposite ends of the empire? Livia might marry us off to anyone. That is not a decision to be made by Livia. It is one my brother shall make. She rose, looking deeply regretful. I should not have read this to you. This day should be free from worry. They will be good matches, she promised, and happy marriages. But I didn't see how she could ensure that. Julia and Marcellus were waiting for us in the atrium, and when they saw our faces, they wanted to know what had happened. A letter from Augustus, my brother replied. Apparently, we're to be married, I said. To whom? Marcellus exclaimed. Not Tiberius, Julia asked in alarm. I recoiled. No, Livia would never allow that. Well, so long as it's not him, she said brightly, how bad can it be? Think of Horatia, I retorted, or any number of terrible marriages. In Egypt, women are allowed to choose their husbands. Marcellus put his arm around my shoulders. Just remember who is heir, he whispered, and I smiled despite myself. Aside from the contents of Augustus's letter, it was a wonderful day, the best birthday I could remember having. As usual, Alexander won his bets at the races. It had rained the night before, but he knew which horses preferred wet tracks to dry, and after taking out the small scroll on which he recorded past performances, he bet on the whites. 50 denarii to the Prince of Egypt, the bet-maker said, handing him a heavy red purse, and another 50 to you. He passed a second purse to Marcellus. We took the winnings with us to the forum, where we all bought nivem dulcem, even though we were freezing, then washed it down with warm, honeyed wine. At the theater, Lucius critiqued the dreadful speech-making, and the 5 of us shouted, Bring on the bear! It was an awful play, but none of us cared. We laughed at the senator who fell asleep in his seat, and at the woman whose snores were disturbing the actors. By the time Alexander and I returned to our chamber, the sun had long since set, and the guards looked ready to collapse. Felicem diem natalem, he repeated, then embraced me tightly. Sleep well. Where are you going? He smiled. And you don't think Octavia will know? It's just for one night. It's been many nights, I said sternly. The slaves talk. Then let them. In 6 months, he added darkly, we'll both be married. We might as well enjoy our freedom while we can. I watched as he disappeared down the hall, then shut my door and blew out the oil lamps. As I was closing my eyes, I imagined that I heard footsteps in the atrium. And I wondered if my brother had changed his mind. But the door didn't open, and I fell into a deep sleep filled with strange dreams. Then suddenly I woke with a start. There was the sound of sandals slapping against marble, then a wail like the scream of a wounded animal tore through the villa, shattering the stillness. Doors were being opened and shut, and slaves were shouting to one another for lamplight. I rushed from my couch and put my cloak on, but I couldn't find my sandals. By the time I found them, I could hear women crying and Vitruvius's voice shouting orders over the madness. I fumbled with the door, unable to find the handle in the darkness, then flung it open and stepped into the hall. Outside, Antonia and Tonia were already up, shivering in their heavy linen sheaths. "What's happening?" I cried, but neither would answer me. "Who is screaming?" I followed their gaze to Lucius's room and then cried out, "Alexander!" No! My light just died. There we go. That's okay. Ha! Oh, I'm drinking. So it's my group mug. So apparently my light just died. I hope you guys can still see me okay. What the heck? Okay. But now I can't see. 1 second, guys. I'm sorry. Oh, God. I swear. The reading, this final reading is cursed or something. I don't know, but oh well. All right, let's see. "What's happening?" I cried, but neither would answer me. "Who's screaming?" I followed their gaze to Lucius's room and then cried out, "Alexander!" Antonia reached out to stop me. "Don't go in there," she pleaded. "Why?" Slaves were running with hot water. Then Vitruvius appeared with bottles and bandages. I approached the chamber slowly, as if still in a dream, and when I saw what happened, my legs nearly gave way beneath me. "Take her away from here!" Vitruvius shouted. A dozen different men were attending to Lucius, who had been wounded in the chest and was lying on the floor. But on the couch, still dressed in his white tunic and cloak, Alexander wasn't moving. Several slaves stepped forward to take me away, but I shrieked at them wildly, "Leave me alone!" I rushed to Alexander and shook him by the shoulders. Blood seeped through the shirt onto the linens. A deep gash ran along his neck, and when I felt his cheeks, they were already cold. "No," I whispered again and again. "No!" I screamed so loud that Isis could hear me. Hands lifted me up, and men began saying things I didn't understand. There was light, and I saw books and sketches. Someone had laid me down on a couch in the library. Gallia and Magister Varius appeared, followed by Juba and Agrippa. There were times when I wasn't sure if I was sleeping or awake. As dawn came, Gallia pressed a cup into my hands. "Drink." "I can't. You've been crying all night. You need fluid," she instructed. I drank, but I didn't taste anything. I could hear Juba questioning the slaves in the atrium, and when he came to me, I turned my face away. "Celine," he said gently. I closed my eyes. "I know you don't wish to speak, but if we're to find who did this, just tell me," I whispered. Is my brother gone?" Both Agrippa and Juba were standing above me, but neither of them spoke. I opened my eyes. "Is he dead?" I cried. Gallia rushed to my side. "Celine, he was attacked. He had no chance." Tears blurred my vision. Then suddenly my mind was as clear as ever. I remembered Augustus's letter to Octavia. "You want to know who did this?" I demanded. "Yes," Juba said. "Then find Octavia. Tell her to bring you Augustus's letter." Juba frowned at me. "Do you think I'm lying? Find Augustus's letter," I shrieked. I heard a slave go running, and when he returned, Octavia was with him. She handed the scroll to me with trembling hands. "What do you want?" she asked nervously. "What's in the letter?" I read the first line to myself, just to be sure I wasn't mistaken. But it was there. "On this, the 15th year of their birth, I hope you wish the Gemini well." The Gemini, meaning Castor and Pollux, the twin sons of Leda, and the brothers to Helen of Troy, except Castor was killed, leaving Pollux all alone. I continued reading, only this time louder. "When I return, it will be my foremost duty to see that a good marriage is made. Be sure to warn Princess Celine, so that when the time comes she has made herself ready." Tears burned my cheeks, and I looked from one face to the other. "A good marriage," I repeated. "One! And why just one?" I shouted angrily. "Because he knew my brother would never be married." When Octavia gasped, I sat up and read, "There is nothing nearly as momentous as the passing from childhood to adulthood, and it is an occasion that merits serious consideration." If these words weren't a death sentence, then what is? He wanted Alexander dead, the last of the Ptolemies, Antony's son, and at 15, a man. "No," Octavia wouldn't believe it. "No," she whispered. Agrippa said firmly, "We will find these men, and they will be tried." But it was a lie. All of it was a lie. Augustus had paraded us through the streets of Rome, and had made a show of raising us before the people. But always, in the back of his mind, he knew that my brother would never live to wear the toga virilis. First Caesarion, then Antyllus, now Alexander. Thunder clapped overhead, and I heard Juba say, "Leave the princess alone. She needs her rest." When Octavia hesitated, he told her firmly, "Go and tend to Lucius." My other half, my twin. How will I live without him? I whispered. Gallia placed a warm cloth on my head. By getting some sleep. But I don't want to sleep. I sat up and searched the room desperately. I want to see him. He's being dressed for burial. Where? I cried. In an unmarked grave? Beneath a plain tombstone on the Appian Way? When I looked up at Juba. You must have known about this, I accused. Don't be ridiculous. Only one man on the Palatine kills for Augustus. His jaw worked angrily. And that man isn't me. I want you to leave. When he didn't move, I screamed violently, I want you away from here! Hurt flickered across his face. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Juba! Gallia called after him. What are you doing? I demanded. He knew about this. He probably planned it. Don't be a fool, Gallia said strictly. He would never do such a thing. How do you know? Who else knows Augustus's closest secrets? His wife, she said when Juba was gone. Livia knows everything. And Livia isn't here. But her slaves are. She pushed me firmly to the couch. They will find them, she promised, but you must rest. There is nothing you can do for him now. Her voice broke, and though she turned, I could see that she was crying. But she was wrong. There was still one thing I could do. I wouldn't let him be buried without a mausoleum, and because Octavia feared that the last of the Ptolemies would end her life by suicide, to Augustus, and he approved. My brother's body was kept in the temple of Apollo, while workers from the Pantheon, the Basilica, and the baths worked day and night for 3 months to finish. And in the time it took to build his tomb, I saw no one unless they came to me. When Marcellus first heard the news of my brother's death, he'd sworn vengeance on Livia and even Augustus, but I'd warned him that if he spoke a word against his uncle, he would suffer next. It was better to wait, I told him, to bide his time until he became emperor. But as winter melted into spring, he was still angry, and even when the Red Eagle posted acta across Rome denouncing the imperial family as murderers who treated their guests like slaves, killing them off with impunity, he wasn't satisfied. No perpetrator had been found for the crime, and though Lucius survived and could describe his assailants, nothing was done. No one spoke of how Alexander had been found in Lucius's room. It was as if their love had never existed. I ate alone, I worked alone, and when I asked Octavia to move me from the chamber I had shared with Alexander, she placed me next to Antonia, who came to me at night and brought me food. Do you think you will return to the triclinium? She asked. It was April, and I shook my head. Not until the mausoleum is done. But it is finished, she protested. His funeral is tomorrow. I blinked away my tears. The priests of Isis and Serapis had embalmed my brother's body, and I had gone to visit him every day in the temple. What would it be like not to have him near me? I'm not sure the tomb is done, I said. But what will you do? Antonia cried. Work on it forever? I turned and looked at her. She had her mother's gray-eyed innocence. Yes, I will. And I would make the mausoleum my second home. When Augustus returned and married me off to some decrepit senator, I would leave my husband as often as possible. And when he'd go searching for me, he'd find me sleeping beside Alexander, the two of us together in a marble eternity. Antonia's eyes filled with tears. But it isn't natural. No, and neither was my brother's death. The funeral began on the Palatine, and as the procession wound its way through the streets, thousands of people came to see the murdered prince of Egypt. He was borne on a bier, carried by slaves, and preceded by the imperial family. I walked at his side, while Lucius and Vitruvius walked behind me. I could hear Lucius weeping, the deep, heart-wrenching cries of a man completely gutted by grief. And if I hadn't been so embittered, I might have gone to offer him some comfort. But I had no reserve of sympathy left in me. It had been cut away with Alexander's life. As we reached his mausoleum on the Appian Way, I wondered which of the people among us had been responsible for my brother's death. But everyone's mourning appeared genuine, and whenever Octavia looked on Alexander, sobs racked her body. An Egyptian embalmer had disguised the wounds across my brother's neck, and if not for the thin layer of gauze across his face, Alexander might have been sleeping. The beautiful curls he had taken such care of were still dark and lustrous, topped by his pearl diadem. He was the last of the male Ptolemies, and my only hope for returning to Egypt. He was my twin and my closest friend, and now his short life was over. We entered the cool recesses of the tomb, and Julia stifled a sob with her fist. The marble plaque she had purchased to celebrate our birthday hung above the sarcophagus. When Castor, who was the mortal, had died, his immortal twin chose to join him in the sky. They were the Gemini, and now Alexander had gone to Elysium to wait for me. The priests of Isis and Serapis lifted my brother's body from the bier into the coffin, singing Egyptian hymns that no Roman would recognize. And when I placed my book of sketches in Alexander's sarcophagus, I saw Vitruvius cover his eyes with his hand. As the lid was lowered, my knees grew weak, but Marcellus steadied me, and I saw Juba flinch as if something about this disturbed him deeply. He regarded us from across the chamber with eyes as hard as onyx, and I thought, if justice truly exists in this world, my brother will be avenged. Then Roman hymns were sung, and Macinius read a long poem in honor of the Ptolemies. Even Tiberius was shaken. His eyes were red as if he'd been weeping, and when he placed a heavy wreath at the front of the tomb, I noticed that his hands were unsteady. But when the ceremony was finished, I could still smell the oil of cedar and myrrh used to perfume my brother's body, and as long as it lingered, I wanted to remain in the mausoleum. "Celine," Lucius said when all the others had left, and we were standing outside, "I'm so sorry." I didn't say anything to him. "I'm sorry it wasn't me, because I know that's what you wanted." Tears welled in my eyes, and my guilt became unbearable. I took my brother's lover into my arms, and the pair of us wept together. It was the will of Isis, I told him, which only made him weep harder. But why? I don't know. Only she knows. When our tears were spent, I looked at Lucius, and I was sure he had aged 10 years in those 3 months. "There's a reason you weren't killed," I said. "The gods are saving you for something great. You have a patron." "But what does it mean without Alexander?" What did anything mean? I let him walk me out into the sunshine, and I felt angry with the world, with the sun for still daring to shine when my life was so dark. Although everyone expected I would rejoin Octavia's meals in the triclinium, I remained shut away in the library, sketching additions to Alexander's mausoleum and the shrine I wished to purchase for him in the Forum. One afternoon Julia came to the library with a letter. She could see that I was working on something for Alexander, but she interrupted me anyway and said, "You should see this." She offered me the scroll, and I read, "We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light." They were Plato's words. I looked up at her. "For you," she said quietly. "From whom?" "Me." When I was silent, she continued, "We will find whoever did this, Celine." But her words died away at my look. "It's been 4 months," I reminded her harshly. "I know, but my father won't be emperor forever. And when I become empress, I swear to you there won't be a plebeian in Rome who doesn't remember Alexander." "But you can't go on living this way," she pleaded, "afraid of being happy, afraid of the light." "It makes me happy to be in the dark," I told her. But Julia gave me a disbelieving look. "You go to his mausoleum every day. What do you do?" "I plan. I work. And how much more work can there be?" "Plenty. I want to build a shrine." "That's fine," she said. "And then what?" "Maybe a statue," I said, giving back her scroll. "Possibly a bust." "And where does it end? What will you do? Spend until your treasury is gone?" She was shaking her head. It's too much, Celine. You have to live. When my father returns, then I'll be forced to live. Only I won't have to worry about being separated from Alexander because he's already gone. Her lower lip trembled, and she pushed Plato's words toward me. I'm sorry, she said, though for what I wasn't sure. I watched her leave, then summoned 2 of the guards to take me to the Appian Way. As we walked down the Palatine, Juba saw me and stepped forward. What? I demanded. Are you here to kill me as well? I hope you're joking. He glanced uneasily at my guards. Augustus saved my brother like a bull for the slaughter, so why shouldn't I be next? And who better to do the job than you? I turned to leave, and he whispered something to the light-haired guard. The man nodded gravely, and as we left I didn't bother asking him what he'd said. But when we reached the mausoleum and I saw what had been done, I spun around. Who did this? I gasped. The light-haired guard replied, Juba. Next to the sarcophagus, in the only light of the chamber, stood the most magnificent statue of Alexander that any sculptor could have crafted. He was sculpted in marble, with eyes painted brown and hair that clustered in perfect ringlets around his diadem. I went to the statue and touched his face, his nose, his lips, his chin. It was as though he were alive, and nothing I could have ever commissioned would have equaled what this artist had done. I approached the light-haired guard and asked him, Are you sure? He nodded. We helped him bring it here. Deep humility and regret silenced me, and the dark-haired guard whispered kindly, There are many men who will miss your brother. You are not alone. Then you don't think Juba killed him? I whispered. The men exchanged looks. Princess, why would he kill a man he was helping to support? When I didn't understand, the Dark One explained, Who do you think has been putting all that gold in your treasury since you've been here? Octavia? Both guards made a face, and the light-haired one said, Maybe she gave you a couch and food, but it was Juba's denarii in the temple of Saturn. We should know. We counted the coins. I looked from one guard to the other, but why? Maybe he felt sorry, the Dark One speculated. His mother was a Greek, captured and sold into slavery when she was young. It was his father who freed her. Then both of them met their end the same as your parents. He knows what it's like to lose a kingdom and have to work even for the tunic on his back. I thought of all the gold my brother had squandered at the races, and the times when I had purchased furs and silks without ever questioning how the money had appeared. Then suddenly an image came to mind of the Greek statue that Juba had found for the Pantheon, and a deep flush crept across my cheeks. Gallia had thought the Venus looked like Tarantilla, but that wasn't why Juba had wanted it. There had been a tender expression in his eyes when I'd caught him looking at me that afternoon. Perhaps his help had been charity at first, but now... As I turned back to the Palatine, I tried not to think of Juba's full, solemn lips turning downward when I'd accused him of Alexander's murder. How many times had he watched me pining for Marcellus, and how could Marcellus have understood our suffering? That evening I decided to appear in the triclinium. For more than 4 months I'd worn only black, but Gallia picked out a tunic of deep violet and gold, something my brother had once praised when I wore it, and commanded me not to weep while she brushed soft azurite above my eyes and a little ochre on my lips. There was a surprised murmur in the rooms as I entered, and I noticed with a pang that the table where Alexander and I used to sit was no longer there. Instead, it had been moved next to Octavia and Vitruvius, and this was where Marcellus and Julia were reclining. Immediately a space was made for me next to Juba, whose strong profile was silhouetted against the candlelight. As I took my seat, there was an uneasy silence. "Welcome back," Claudia said, and each person offered a quiet welcome. Then slowly conversation resumed, and it was as if I had never been gone. They were careful not to laugh too much, and even Tiberius held his tongue. But it was Juba who concerned me most, and I finally turned to him. "I was wrong," I said. "About what?" he asked shortly. I underestimated your generosity, and the statue of my brother was very kind. It wasn't for you. It was for Alexander. I flushed. Either way, it was very thoughtful, and make no mention of it. He stood. It is time for me to say valete, he announced. There is a great deal to prepare if Augustus is approaching. He's coming back? I exclaimed. Juba regarded me gravely. With 50,000 members of the Alpine Selassie. As prisoners of war? Slaves, Tiberius said. Although only Juno knows where they're going to fit in a city already swimming with Gauls. Everyone looked at me, and I realized why I hadn't been told. They didn't want me to panic. They were afraid I might take my own life, the way my mother took hers when everything was lost and Augustus was on the horizon. From the first time he had seen us in Alexandria, Augustus had known when my brother would die. A grown son of Mark Antony and Cleopatra would be a rallying point across the empire, a threat not only in Egypt but in Rome. There had never been hope of returning to Egypt, no matter how hard we worked to become useful to him. Why don't you come with us? Julia asked quickly. Marcellus and I are going to the theater. I shook my head. You should go, Octavia prompted. It's a Greek play tonight. Sophocles, Marcellus said. No, I think I will go to my chamber. Vitruvius gave a meaningful look to his son, so I wasn't surprised when someone knocked on my door that evening, and it was Lucius. Did your father send you? I asked. For a moment, Lucius considered lying. Then he admitted, yes, but I would have come either way. I let him inside, and his eyes grew big. It was a little Egypt, with rich swaths of red silk hanging from the walls, and bronze incense burners in the shape of sphinxes. An ankh hung over my couch next to an image of Isis. I no longer cared if I upset Augustus, or if the slaves wrote to Livia about my chamber. What more could be done to me? What else could I lose? So is this what Alexandria is like? Lucius asked. I laughed sadly. A pale imitation. He seated himself on my leather chair, casting about for something to say. I guess you've heard that the Senate has voted to give Augustus tribunician power for life. That's even bigger than the consulship. Yes, he owns the world now. But not you. I looked up. No one can keep you from drawing, Celine. No matter what happens, you'll still have the support of Octavia and Vitruvius. And do you know what Julia and Marcellus are doing? They're making plans to build a house for foundlings, and they say it's in honor of you. Did they ask you to tell me this? No. This time his answer was firm. But I lost a great friend too, and some days, even when I don't want to carry on, I do. He blinked rapidly. You know that Augustus arrives tomorrow. Immediately, thoughts of Augustus's death returned, and I wondered whether someone might assassinate him. There are reports that he's sick, Lucius went on. We all know that he's never been strong. Even the mild weather in Iberia hasn't been enough to keep him in good health. When he comes, please don't do anything rash. What makes you think I would? He gave me a long look. You aren't known for your prudence. Perhaps someone else will do it for me then. You are the last of the Ptolemies, Celine. There is no one else after you whose veins carry the blood of Alexander the Great and Cleopatra. Be careful, or everything your grandfathers fought for will be snuffed out. It already is. No, not unless the last Ptolemy dies. When word was sent ahead from the walls of Rome that Augustus was about to enter the city, we gathered in the forum, and I thought of Ptolemies who had come before me and wondered what they would do. I knew what my mother had chosen, an honorable suicide over ignominy. But what would she have done if she were standing on the steps of Saturn's temple, wearing a Roman bulla and waiting to greet the man who had murdered her family? I searched the temple steps for Juba, who had come here every month to deposit denarii in a treasury chest for Alexander and me without ever telling us. When I couldn't find him, I asked Agrippa. He's been sent ahead to inspect the spoils. The Cantabri left behind thousands of statues. Why? Where did they go? They chose death over slavery, Agrippa said solemnly. Next to me, Gallia's blue eyes narrowed, and I imagined how difficult it must be for her to witness a second subjugation of her people. The war trumpets blared, and from the sounds of the crowds lining the Vicus Jugarius, it was evident that the army had arrived. I felt someone squeeze my hand. He's coming, Julia said, but there was a nervousness in her voice that made me wonder how happy she was. Drums beat out a rhythm to the approaching horses' hooves, and Octavia shouted, "There he is!" White horses with red plumage came into view, and then Augustus, the triumphant conqueror of foreign lands, appeared at the head of his army in a golden chariot. I could see at once that he had lost weight, but a muscled cuirass disguised his weakness, and the paleness of his face was covered with vermilion. Livia rode behind him in a chariot of her own, followed by all the generals who had really won the war. The crowd worked itself into a frenzy as thousands of Gauls rolled by in filthy cages, and soldiers held up urns of gold, amphorae, and silverita. Augustus stopped before the temple of Saturn. Because no one wanted to hear the misery of the weeping Gauls, soldiers rolled the cages into the courtyard of the Basilica Julia, where they'd be kept until the prisoners could be sold. Augustus descended from his chariot, and the cheers that rose as his victorious generals gathered around him must have deafened the gods. Agrippa held out a golden laurel wreath, and I turned my head, disgusted by the spectacle. Instead, I watched the soldiers outside the basilica as they attempted to organize more than 500 cages. It was madness, and from my vantage point of the steps I could see more soldiers hurrying from the basilica to help in the fray. But as I watched, I realized that the supposed reinforcements weren't soldiers. The men were dressed as legionnaires, in the right sandals, crested helmets, and scarlet cloaks, but black masks covered the top half of their faces. I gasped. The Red Eagle had come to free the Gauls. The men were working swiftly, opening cage after cage, and instructing the prisoners to remain where they were until the signal was given. Somehow the Red Eagle had come by keys, and as lock after lock opened, I could see the prisoners rushing to the sides of their cages. Then one of the soldiers on the temple steps followed my gaze and saw what was happening. "They're escaping!" he shouted, interrupting Augustus's triumph. "The prisoners are escaping!" he cried. From across the courtyard, one of the masked men looked up and realized they'd been seen. "Go!" he shouted, and though he'd spoken in Gaulish, I was familiar with the word from Gallia's reprimands. The doors were flung open, and thousands of prisoners began to flee. Panic ensued in the basilica's courtyard, and the liberatores discarded their masks. Soldiers, uncertain who was on their side and who wasn't, fired arrows indiscriminately into the crowd. One arrow struck the rebels' leader, and I saw him clutch his shoulder in agony. "He's been hit!" I shrieked. Gallia rushed forward. "Come back here, Selene!" "But he's been wounded!" It didn't matter that I ran. Everyone was moving, and it was impossible to remain on the steps of the temple. Smoke rose from the rooftop of the Basilica Julia, and a woman screamed, "The basilica's on fire!" While thousands of people ran from the flames, I rushed toward them. A woman with 2 children in her arms warned me to turn back, shouting that the fire would take the entire building. But I followed a trail of blood into an abandoned shop, and I heard a man behind the counter breathing heavily. I rushed to him, but as soon as he saw me, he turned his face away. "Go," he growled. "I'm here to help you." "How? By getting yourself killed?" "No, there's a tunnel. It leads to the house of the Vestals, and from there you can escape." "Then tell me where it is and get yourself out of here." "I can't describe it. You'll have to trust me." He hesitated, and when he turned, I covered my mouth in shock. "Juba!" "Who did you think you would find?" he asked grimly. "Marcellus?" I ignored the sting in his words and bent over him. He was losing a great deal of blood, and I ripped my tunic to make a bandage. My hands trembled when I touched the heat of his skin. But the man who saved us in the Forum Boarium was blond. Even Julia saw him. "And there are such things as wigs," he said sharply. "Then what about the Actum while you were in Gaul?" I tried not to think about the sudden wetness on my tunic, though I knew it was his blood. There are others who would seek to end slavery as well. I was aware of my hair brushing his chest as I tied his binding. It took several knots before it stayed in place. "That's enough," he said gruffly. "Where is the point?" He drew my eyes to a bloodied shaft on the floor, and though my stomach clenched, I could see that its point was still intact. Nothing remained in his body. But if he wasn't stitched soon, it might not matter. I offered him my arm, and he took it without complaining. "Can you run?" "Yes." We rushed through the Basilica Julia. Smoke was beginning to fill the halls, and Juba leaned more heavily on me than he probably intended. I could feel he was weakening, and quickly I tried to recall one of Vitruvius's sketches. The basilica housed law courts, offices, and shops, and the Vestals had wanted a tunnel from their temple so they could reach the shops without being seen. But to which shop had it led? "Are you sure you know where you're going?" he demanded. "I've seen the sketch more than a dozen times." I led him inside a silk merchant's taberna and looked around. The shop had been abandoned, and customers had fled without taking their purchases. I grabbed a woman's tunic and flung it over my shoulder. I would change before we reached the Palatine. "Where is the tunnel?" "I don't know, but it's here." Juba stepped behind the counter, where a heavy curtain covered the wall. With a flick of his wrist, he swept it aside, revealing an open door. He stepped inside first, and when he was sure that it was safe, he leaned on my arm and allowed me to guide him. There was nothing inside to relieve the darkness, and as we hurried, I felt my way along the wall. "You should change," he said. I stopped walking, and though I knew he couldn't see me as I undressed, my cheeks grew warm at the thought of him there. I remembered the last time I had stood in my breastband and loincloth in front of him. We had been in the Blue Grotto, and I had tried to keep myself from staring at his half-naked body in the water. What should I do with the bloodied— "Give it to me. Now hurry." As we continued down the tunnel, his breathing grew more labored. "Where will you go when we reach the temple?" I asked. "To the Palatine." "And how will you explain your wound?" "The soldiers were shooting at everyone," he said shortly. "They'll simply think I was in their way." "But will Augustus believe it?" He didn't reply, though when we reached the end of the tunnel, I thought for a moment he might say something more. Instead, he reached down and offered me his dagger. "What's this for?" "You don't remember your first trip down the Palatine alone?" "But that was at night." "And do you think that criminals disappear in the day?" "I'll be behind you," he promised, "but you must leave first. When the path is clear, I want you to whistle. Then start walking, all the way to the Palatine." My hand trembled violently as I took the dagger. I slipped it safely beneath my belt, then opened the door and stepped out onto the marble portico outside the Temple of Vesta. I was shocked to see that the entrance was empty. Everyone has gone to see the fire, I thought. I whistled immediately, and when I heard the door open, I began to walk. Gallia knew where I had gone, and it was possible that Tiberius had heard as well. If I returned to the Palatine with Juba, only a fool would fail to realize what had happened. Throughout the city, men were rushing to the Forum. Even merchants were abandoning their stalls to see the fire that was consuming the basilica. It took all my resolve not to turn to see if Juba was still behind me. When I reached Octavia's villa, there was no one on the portico, and I knew at once where everyone must have gone. But before I could reach the platform in front of Augustus's villa, Gallia came running. "Where is he?" she cried. I thought of Juba bleeding inside his villa with no one to help him, and I did my best to look unconcerned. "Who?" Gallia gave me a long look before whispering, "Juba." I leaned closer. "How do you—" "I have been in his confidence since the Red Eagle first appeared," she said quickly. "Who do you think posted his acta while he was gone? Is he safe?" I told her what had happened, and her face went pale. "Stay here and say absolutely nothing." I panicked. "But where are you going?" "To find Varius." I mounted the platform and tried to avoid Augustus's interested gaze. Immediately, Marcellus and Julia cried out. "Where have you been?" Julia exclaimed. "I was caught up in the rush," I lied, hoping that I was as good an actor as Augustus. "I didn't know where you went, and when I looked back, everyone was gone." Augustus studied me. It had been a year since he had last seen me. "They thought perhaps you'd been crushed," he said. "Of course not. I escaped, But hundreds of people were trampled, Julia said. Did you see? I shook my head. Then you must have seen the Gauls escaping from their cages. It was the barbarian invasion all over again, she said breathlessly. Augustus watched for my reaction, but I refused to give one. Then he turned abruptly to Livia and said, I'll be in my chamber. Octavia rushed to his side, and I noticed that both Agrippa and Tiberius were absent. When Augustus was gone, I looked to Julia. Is he sick? My father has been ill since Iberia. He says this afternoon will be the death of him, and he's told Agrippa to find the Red Eagle whatever the cost. I heard the Red Eagle was wounded, Marcellus added, and Tiberius thought you ran after him. He's a traitor. Why would I do such a thing? That's what I said, but he thought you would try and escape from Rome. Although all I had wished to do was run to Juba's villa, I remained on the hill and watched the fire burn. When at last even Julia was tired of the show, she asked Claudia whether there was to be a feast. No, your father needs his rest. Perhaps in a few days, when the Red Eagle is dead, there will be a celebration. Julia looked at me. Will you dine with us? Not tonight. I'm not feeling well, I lied again. I hurried back to my chamber, hoping that Gallia would be waiting for me, but the room was empty. Then I spotted something dark peeking from beneath my pillow. It was a small black box. I picked it up and read the note that was attached. In case tomorrow never comes, it said. I opened the hidden box and took out a necklace of pink sea pearls. My mother's last gift to me. The one I had given to Juba to purchase Gallia's freedom. Tears blurred my vision as I put on the necklace. He must have left it in the morning, not knowing whether he would survive the day. And now his fate was up to the gods. I paced my room, desperate for any news. And when Octavia returned, I asked if she'd seen Gallia. She's gone home, she said, and I noticed the half-moons beneath her eyes. She looked drained, as if she'd stayed up for nights on end without sleep. A fever is spreading through Rome, she added, and Gallia tells me that both Magister Varius and Juba are ill. The physicians say my brother may be suffering from the same sickness, but you are safe. She reached out and caressed my cheek. A tear wet her finger, and I noticed that she was crying as well. Shall we pray? I followed her into the lararium, where she lit a cone of incense, and we knelt before the gods. She whispered her prayers to Fortuna, and I made my silent ones to Isis. I promised all sorts of things to the goddess, swearing to marry whomever Augustus chose, even if he was vile, so long as she would spare Juba's life. And I vowed to endure my suffering in silence. I would not complain. I would not be embittered. If she would grant Juba's health, I would never weep in self-pity again. But the night passed without a word, and the next morning Gallia was nowhere to be found. I paced the library until Vitruvius put down his stylus and insisted I go outside for fresh air. If you're worried on behalf of Magister Varius, you needn't be. I saw him this morning, and he looked well. You did? I cried. Where? Vitruvius looked at me strangely. On the Palatine, coming from Juba's villa. And what did he say? That Juba is ill? And that Gallia was with him? And was Gallia with him? Vitruvius shook his head. No, not that I saw. I hurried onto the portico, hoping to catch a glimpse of Magister Varius, but the only person hurrying toward Octavia's villa was Agrippa. When he saw me, he smiled. Excellent news, he said triumphantly. Has the Red Eagle been caught? Even better. He's dead. I felt my heart stop in my chest, but Agrippa went on. 2 men caught him last night attempting to post an actum on the temple of Apollo. He was already hurt, but they ran him through with a gladius as he fled. Suddenly the world was spinning. It was Alexander's death all over again. And is there a body? No, but judging from the amount of blood he left behind, there's no chance that he survived. He went inside to share his triumph with Octavia, and I held on to a column to keep from falling. I had to find Gallia. Gallia or Magister Varius would know what had happened. I raced to the bottom of the Palatine without bothering to demand a guard. I banged on Magister Varius's door at the end of the street. When no one answered, I peered through the windows, and a child who was passing by stopped to stare at me. "There's no one there," he said. "How do you know?" "I live next door. They haven't been back all night." "What about this morning?" The boy shook his head. "Not even Magister Varius?" "No." I took the shortcut back up the hill. I didn't dare to approach Juba's villa, but I went to the Temple of Apollo to see for myself. A group of praetorians were gathered at the entrance, and I recognized 2 of the guards as the same men who had accompanied me to Alexander's mausoleum. They were talking quietly between themselves, admiring the stain across the marble steps. It was just as Agrippa had described it. No one could lose so much blood and survive. I could feel my throat beginning to close, and the world was growing dark around me when the light-haired guard from the mausoleum shook my arm. "It's only blood. Nothing to be worried about." "Who stabbed him?" I whispered. "We did." He pointed from himself to the familiar dark-haired guard beside him. "I expect we'll both be amply rewarded." I felt sick to my stomach. Suddenly, nothing made sense any more. When I returned to Octavia's villa, I shut myself in my room. Charmian, Ptolemy, Caesarion, Antyllus, Alexander, both of my parents, and now Juba, the man who had cared for me all along, protecting me, writing about the injustices I cared passionately about as well, all in the guise of the Red Eagle. It no longer mattered to me whether I lived or died. I lay down and closed my eyes, hoping that someone would steal out of the shadows as they had 4 months before, only this time that it would be my life that ended. But when I awoke, the sun was still high. No one had come to murder me in my sleep. There was noise in the atrium, and when I opened the door, Octavia and Vitruvius were whispering. They stopped when I appeared, and both of them looked at me. Octavia approached. Her face was full of concern. "Augustus would like to see you," she said. "Really?" I asked indifferently. "Is he angry?" "I don't know. He's very ill, Celine, and preparations are being made." I could see she was on the verge of tears, and I softened my voice. "He has always recovered. But this time it's fever. He's asked us to bring you." When I nodded, she released her breath. She had expected a fight, but I no longer cared what happened to me. I followed her into Augustus's villa, where dignitaries crowded together in the atrium, and even Julia and Marcellus were there. "He asked to see you," Julia said nervously. "Do you know why?" I shook my head. "I think you're going to be married." When I didn't react, she went on fretfully. "No one knows who it is. I don't even think Livia knows. But he's making all his plans. He's even given Agrippa his signet ring." "The one belonging to Alexander the Great?" She nodded. "So, Agrippa's his heir?" "Until Marcellus is 20. I could see the fear in her eyes. "Oh, Celine." She took my hands, but I didn't move. "Whatever happens, I am here. It will be all right." Octavia guided me to the stairs and pointed upward. "The first door on the right." I mounted the steps, and as I approached the door, I was aware of a rushing sound in my ears. But why was I afraid? It didn't matter what future Augustus decided for me now. I opened the door and realized that I wasn't entering a chamber, but Augustus's office, Little Syracuse. The walls were adorned with maps and scrolls, and where there weren't books, there were statues. A pale-looking Augustus was seated behind his table, hunched over like an old man trying to fend off the cold. With his hand he offered me a seat. "Cleopatra Celine," he said. "Emperor Augustus?" He smiled at the title, but didn't disagree. "Do you know why I've called you here?" I didn't lie. "Julia says it has something to do with my marriage." "Yes," he studied me. "You've grown very beautiful in my absence." "Many things have happened in your absence," I said shortly. He raised his brows, but instead of growing angry with me, his voice became strangely regretful. "Yes, they have. And once we die, What we leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others. Pericles. He nodded. And I have not woven much happiness into your life, have I? I dug my nails into my palms to keep myself from weeping. Before I die, I wish to change that, Celine. Are you going to bring Alexander back from the dead? He hesitated. You understand, I hope, that a grown son of Mark Antony and Cleopatra would always be a risk to the stability of Rome so long as he was alive. The stability of Rome or the stability of your rule? Is there a difference? He never wanted to be Caesar. Many men have no intention of being Caesar, but when offered the opportunity by discontented senators, how many would turn it down? I bit my lower lip. I did not bring you here to discuss death, he said quietly. I brought you here to give you a new life. You had a very fine education in Egypt, and in Rome you have proven yourself capable of rule. If you will accept a dowry of 5,000 denarii, he began, I wish to make you queen of Mauritania. The study began to spin so quickly that I gripped the sides of my chair. I don't understand, I whispered. I thought that Juba is ill? Yes, but he is young and very strong. Men like him recover quickly. And he's waiting for you in the other room. I stood so quickly that my seat nearly toppled over. Augustus smiled. At the end of the hall. I don't remember whether I ran. I must have, because when I opened the door and Juba took me in his arms, I was breathless. Immediately I inspected him for signs that he'd been wounded again. I don't understand, was all I could say. He put his finger to my lips. The men at the temple were mine. There was no attack. But the mess, I whispered. It was bull's blood. I think I'm going to survive. And your shoulder? He pushed his tunic away so I could see where Magister Varius had neatly stitched him closed, and in the bright light of the chamber I knew there'd never been a more beautiful man. From the time I'd been taken from Alexandria, he must have known that Augustus had intended me for him. Then I thought of the times he'd seen me weeping for Marcellus, and the many times I'd goaded him for being nasty when all of it had simply been an act to keep away suspicion. And my eyes began to burn. I hope you're crying with happiness, he said, and not with disappointment. How could I be disappointed? I cried. Perhaps you wanted someone else? I ran my fingers through his hair. No. I searched his eyes, which were filled with kindness, and I drew my fingers over the handsome contours of his face. I want you. Me or the Red Eagle? He asked cautiously. Perhaps both. But you know that the Red Eagle is gone, he said. I've done what I can in Rome. Someone else must continue the fight. Like Gallia and Varius and many other good people. But Augustus would have suspected it was me eventually. So I'm afraid your Red Eagle is dead, he said with regret. Dead? I asked him. Or just flown away to Mauritania? When he didn't say anything, I added, I suspect it's the latter. There will be no more rebellion, no more daring acts of kindness, he warned. You mean we won't get to run through burning buildings? I could see he wanted to laugh, but he watched me intently. What? Why are you staring at me? I'm not staring. I'm observing. I smiled through my tears. And what do you observe? He brushed his lips against my ear. A brave young woman who has always fought for what was right, even when it was unpopular. A woman who can't return to the land of her birth, but is welcome to cross the seas and rebuild Alexandria in mine. And a woman who has suffered enough in Rome and deserves happiness for a change. Will you come to Mauritania and be my queen? He drew back to look at me, but I held him closer. Yes. Just yes? I nodded and pressed my lips against his. We did it. For the second time around, we did it. Oh my God. I'm praying that this processes. I'm praying that TikTok does not screw me over and make me have to read this ending again for the third time. I'm getting off now. I'm going to go eat dinner. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my Tuesday night, and I hope that you guys do too. Um, Friday, I'm not going to be reading. Like I said, this week I was supposed to be off, but technology did its thing. I will see you Tuesday. Next Tuesday, 8 to 9:30 like always. And we'll be reading from Leonardo Swans. I will see you guys next week. Mwah! Have a great night.